If you're wondering about what focusing-oriented coaching means, and I'll assume because you've clicked here, you might have some curiosity. Well, let me start by clarifying that it has nothing to do with focusing as in vision correction, nor is it about the business of being more focused in our tasks, as we often use that term these days. What it refers to here is an approach developed by some researchers at Chicago University in the mid-20th century that is shown to work with, well, let's just say it helps you gain access to your biggest version of thinking. To understand better, we need to head back to Chicago University in the mid-1950s. It was a time when the understanding of human psychology and how humans think was being radically reshaped. The computer was just entering into popular consciousness, and there was a view that in many scientific circles saw that we humans functioned in kind of similar ways to the computer, that the brain was a kind of CPU and that thinking was a sort of logical math type function of the brain's outputs. For a long time, the psychological sciences had also been dominated by analytic models of the human by titans such as Freud and Jung, and they also saw humans as a kind of logical problem to a degree. That the human was a sort of problem that could be solved by decoding the patient's brokenness or problems or issues or thinking through the analyst's models, and by applying from that a prescribed course of treatment. But by the mid-20th century, when we now arrive, an alternative view to all of these had begun to emerge. It came through a new field called humanistic psychology that saw humans as innately capable and naturally inclined towards health, healing, happiness, wholeness, and what they called self-actualization, self-growth and development. And in Chicago, one of the leading lights of that field, the psychologist Carl Rogers, was a professor of psychology. It just so happened that Rogers was wanting to get going on a really massive research project called an outcomes study. And Rogers had founded a whole new humanistic approach in psychotherapy called person-centered therapy or person-centered psychotherapy. And he wanted to study it to see if we could understand how humans improved while others didn't, or what humans improved while others didn't throughout these therapeutic conversations. And if so, we could then understand what might be the causes or the mechanisms that cause success, so they could then improve the client outcomes. Into this picture came a young philosophy student or PhD named Eugene Gendlin. And as a philosopher, Gendlin had been deeply curious about how humans experience life in the world underneath the level of conscious language systems and thinking, where it happened down here before it became all the conscious thinking processes. It was a realm that science calls explicit consciousness, the explicit conscious thinking process. Gendlin was most curious about the less clear zone that we tend to refer to as intuition commonly, or unconscious, but many psychologists and philosophers describe it as implicit consciousness. Gendlin's interest was following in the wake of some really heavyweight thinkers in the field called phenomenology, and these include Husserl and Hegel and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, though there's just many, many more. It seems the young Gendlin decided some practical psychology would really help clarify things for him. So one day he enlisted in a psychotherapy practice course with none other than the good old Rogers. Rogers was pretty quick to recognise Gendlin's academic chops and handed him the plum role of overseeing this massive study. In time, Gendlin surfaced, announcing that he'd narrowed down a few key traits in folk who really seemed to change through these conversations. Now, one was about how people related to their issues. They had too much distance, they were too separated from it, it meant they were just too disassociated and they had no real felt connection to it, and nothing really seemed to shift much. If they were too close into their problem, they were just enveloped in it, like they had their head in the soup, and they were simply just overwhelmed and unable to have any perspective. Not a lot happened there either. The middle way, the one where things really shifted, was those ones who could just get a little perspective. They could talk about their situations without either being overwhelmed or too disconnected and too much in either direction. The other factor that was important to note, and Gendlin thought this was particularly crucial, was how some people related to their issues when they came up, when they started to seem to go into problem-solving mode and things seemed to shift for them. When they spoke about them, they tended to slow down a little bit, go in, feel around for the kind of language. Their words actually became more imagistic, more metaphoric and almost poetic. It was almost as though they were connecting with a language that was coming directly from their interior. All the stuff of Gendlin's own curiosity about this implicit level of our thinking processes. Now, while these outcomes eventually, of course, impacted on Roger's approach to therapy, Gendlin himself went on to formulate them into a process he called focusing, a simple stepped process for being able to work with this implicit level of thinking. About that, here's a quote from one of his colleagues and a really long-term friend, the psychoanalyst and researcher Lynn Preston, that beautifully captures his approach. Focusing is an active receptivity to the vague inklings of what is just beyond the horizon of awareness. It is Eugene Gendlin's name for the process of sensing into implicit experience a felt sense of the complex intricacy under the surface of words and thoughts. Like going fishing, focusing is a way of relaxing into the boat of oneself and waiting attentively for a nibble from below. Even though the fish might be out of sight, we attune ourselves to its movements and hold gently but firmly to the line of connection with it. This kind of experiential responding joins the inner world and the relational world. As it emerged from the psychotherapeutic studies, it was natural for focusing to find a home within the therapeutic traditions and has done so, generally called FOT or focusing oriented therapy. In 1978, Gendlin published a really simple, great little book simply titled Focusing that was aimed more probably towards the self-help market, using the simple 6 steps that he distilled the process into. I'm not going to break down any of those or any of that here, as his simple little short book does such a terrific job. Go read it. Plus, there's a wealth of folk out there doing exactly that. You can find them all over, including on YouTube. What I believe is crucial for coaching here is firstly that this piece of work is astonishingly getting to the real heart of our and our clients' thinking, feeling processes about everything. An important fact here is that the modern field of cognitive science tells us that it's the rule of thumb amongst all of these cognitive scientists that the explicit conscious thought process is at best only 5% of what we have available. The other 95% or more lies outside in what they call implicit consciousness. Yet they all agree that this implicit thinking or cognition is creating and shaping all of the explicit thinking processes. If we conceptualize those explicit and implicit in this kind of well-worn image of the iceberg, we can see this a little better. The top level is all about logic, concepts, rationality, and is actually quite limited in its processing capacity. Whereas this implicit is a vast place of great complexity, feeling senses, more complexity in meaning, and far more processing power, non-linear processing power, hence the prevalence of metaphor and so forth as this underneath the language system. While we definitely need both systems, all too often this top level is trying to solve problems rationally that aren't a problem that can ever be solved at that level. They're ones that are far more affective and complex. So if we're able to solve issues at a more felt and implied level, we might have a whole lot more impact, right? Gendlin coined the term felt sense to describe precisely this, mainly the sort of meeting place where the implicit, the conscious, unconscious actually meet, which is the sort of borderlands, the felt borderlands where we can begin to function and where the decoding and the languages start to translate. We feel the situations well before we have clear ideas or answers, and we all know this. When we walk into rooms and we know what did I come here and I feel it here, but it's not clear in consciousness. It is talking about intuitive senses, but in fact this work is about much bigger processes as well. If it's sounding a little edgy, then you're not alone. Mainstream approaches are not always welcoming to this type of work. The feeling sensory ways of problem solving have been seen as just fluffy and new agey, or simply no match for those based in our really good, clear linear logic systems. But that's not necessarily been the view of many of the major professional bodies, including the American Psychological Association, who have awarded Gendlin 4 awards for his contributions to the understanding and advancement of human psychological technologies and processes. So I think the other thing that challenges people is it asks for a certain level of development and complexity in practitioners rather than more analytic, if not sometimes paint by numbers approaches. The second reason why I think this is so relevant for coaching is that humanistic psychology and the subsequent person-centered therapeutic tradition that both spawned focusing are also the precursors of coaching. Sure, there's plenty of other influences that we can point to, like sport and academic coaching and so forth, but this person-centered approach, born out of humanistic psychology, all viewed the client as fully capable and the practitioner as facilitator, not guiding expert, and that clearly preempts the modern coaching approach. Equally, the conversations that Gendlin drew his insights from were still just facilitated conversations of change, right? The intentions were slightly different, but the commonalities are vast. And those findings are as rich for coaching as they are for therapy. I'm not also, as you probably noticed, breaking down any of the details of how to do this here, but despite their common ground, there are of course some important differences. Therapy is explicitly working with clinically significant mental health issues and has a healing orientation, whereas coaching or coaches are just not trained to do either of those and have to be very careful about it. At a very high level, the real task in coaching is about supporting clients to overcome personal and professional challenges and to live more fulfilling lives, to acquire their life goals. Both function on conversations, but with different lenses. A key difference that we teach in relation to focusing on oriented coaching is where therapeutic sessions and engagements will also be less structured and generally of longer duration. Coaching sessions have a real structure and the engagements are usually fairly short and agreed, finishing when the client just achieves an agreed desired goal or outcome. There is undoubtedly a lot more detail, but I think this gives something of a good snapshot of what focusing is, how it fits into coaching, and why it is the most unacknowledged, science-based way to help clients gain insights and overcome their inner challenges out there. If you're interested in knowing more, then jump onto our website. Details here in the links where you can read more, or of course, you can come along and do our focusing oriented coaching training.